So, YJKYM, our basic training stance, the character to goat pinching stance. People translate it slightly differently here and there, but that's more or less accurate. We're not going to go into that because we're not going to actually break down the stance itself. But the thing is that it's a training stance, it's not a fighting stance. And so you can sit there and ask, well, why do we stand with the feet pointed inwards a little bit? Why do we sink the weight, tuck the hips, drop the ribs, keep the spine nice and tall, right? Why do we do all this? And it turns out this is just a basic sequencing effect for learning how to brace our posture. And you can see you can see corollaries to it in, of course, white crane, which is one of our ancestor styles, and then you can see it in the sanchin kata that you see done in Goju Ryu and some other karate styles. They don't have it square here, they have it more offset. There's a brilliant video of Morihige Onna going over the sanchin stance, and it's a far better explanation of what's going on than what most people give in Wing Chun. But more than that, if you look at guys like Kelly Starrett, who's not a martial artist at all, at least not that I know of, and they talk about all of these positional cues. And so we're gonna leave out the pigeon toe for a moment right now. So, and in fact, we're gonna ignore the knees for a moment right now. Let's look at the hips. What are we doing when we pull the hips under? Kelly's cue is to squeeze the butt. And I think that is just an absolutely brilliant cue, because squeezing the butt pulls my hips into a nice stable position right under the spine, and it allows me to keep the natural, normal curvature of the spine. You don't want your spine to be straight. There is an S-curve in it, and it's supposed to be a very gentle S-curve. It's not supposed to be this hard, compressed spring of a curve. It's a very, very gentle curve, but it's supposed to be there. You don't want a straight spine. That's not how we're built. It's not how we're supposed to be built. And so by just squeezing the butt, you stabilize the hips directly underneath your spine. And then when we do that, what happens? A lot of people do that and they start tilting back. So you do, drop the ribs. So you keep the butt squeezed, you drop the ribs. Now you have abdominal bracing, right? Keep the shoulders sunk down, straighten the neck out, keep the chin, tucked back a little bit, nice straight spine. All of this is just a spinal bracing procedure to make sure that you have good posture and a good stack. That is absolutely beautiful. Now let's look at what's going on in the feet. So I'm going to pull up my right pant leg here so you can see. These are not very forgiving pants. So you can see my knee. So if I'm standing here and my feet are straight, and my knee is more or less straight, right? So if I'm standing here, my hips, my knees, my toes all need to be going forward. One of the problems that we see, and I see this in a lot of my students, is collapsed arches and a knee that tracks inward. This is a valgus fault. This is not a good position to be in. And it's something I see less commonly, but is pushing it out the other way. I think it's called the varus fault. It's been a little while since I looked at that. And it starts peeling the toes up off the ground here, and we're externally rotating, but we're not doing it through the tissues. We're doing it by compensating position, and that's not good. So I need my feet to face forward. I need my knees to face forward. I need good arches, strong gripping feet with whole foot contact, right? Straight hip flexors, all that jazz. So again, why would we do the pigeon-toed point? Well, have you ever noticed that a lot of people walk here with the feet turned out? Naturally, because our hips want to move forward. So naturally, if we do this, the knees and the hips are still trying to move forward, so you end up with this kind of motion, and in some people more than others, this is really bad. And the worst part is wearing shoes with a thick heel wedge makes this particularly bad, because it changes your movement pattern enough that you have to walk around the block in your movement pattern. And so we create all sorts of pathologies for ourselves by just not being barefoot. You know, your shoes should be relatively minimal, spend a lot more time barefoot, be conscious of your posture, all that kind of stuff. But now it's true, we don't want to be pigeon-toed all the time either. That presents its own issues, right? We want to be forward. So again, it comes back to, what are we doing in our stance when we're here and we're forward? This is an important thing. This is an extremely important thing. When I'm here, let me measure it out properly. Popping the toes out as wide as I can, bringing them out here. Now, you'll notice I'm roughly shoulder width. It's a good, stable position to be in. So why are my toes pointing in a little bit? Well, it turns out that's a really, really good cue to make sure that the big toe stays on the ground and we're not peeling out when we stabilize the hips. If I don't do anything to my hips, watch what happens to my knee when I squeeze my butt. It naturally pulls it out that way, right? So if I'm standing here and I squeeze my butt, all of a sudden my toes are getting lighter. Turning the toes in, it allows me, as I squeeze my butt and I get that natural rotation in there, to keep my feet on the ground. So what I'm developing is an extremely stable structure all the way from my big toe, through my knees, into my hips, up through my spine. Now, of course, we sink the weight, and sinking the weight helps us get the weight off of the heels. We don't want our weight in our heels, and you Wing Chun people that are putting the weight in the heels, you're doing it wrong. The foot should be on the ground, but you should be balanced over the midfoot, whole foot balance. From toe to heel, the weight should be evenly distributed. So when I sink my center of gravity, there's all sorts of reasons for that, and I drop my knees in and I squeeze my butt, what happens? My knees stay pointing in the same direction as my toes. I'm keeping a good stable structure. I'm not leaning, I'm not sticking my butt out, right? This is an isometric structural strengthening exercise. That's what it is. So when you're doing your, Sil and Tao form, you want to make sure that all this is in line and in check. One more thing you can do, and you don't have to go as extreme as Dr. Kelly Starrett likes to do, but as you're doing this, you can actually manually rotate the knees out without moving your feet. And that helps as well. It may not be necessary to go that far, but at the very least, you want to make sure your knees are pointing the same direction as your toes. One of the biggest faults I see in this stance is people just collapse. Valgus fault all day, and then they wonder why they have knee problems, they have hip problems, they have ankle problems, because you're collapsing your arches, you're collapsing your support structure. That's not good. This stance is not meant to be this collapsed stance. And just doing this is putting a lot of pressure on my knee that I don't like. Sink, right? And it's there. Any pinching that happens really should be incidental. I've done this, I have a big dog. If I sink and my knees are in the same line as my toes by being pigeon-toed, they naturally pinch, and my 90-pound dog is pinned, and I don't have to use my adductors to pinch her, right? I'm not doing an Elvis dance here. So you want to make sure that you have everything stacked and in line. This is totally an exercise stance. It's a structure and stability stance. It's for training. It is not for fighting. So here's a really cool cue if you want to look at all this stuff. You take a belt. I just happen to have a white belt here. Right under the big toe, over and around the foot, right around the ankle, just above the ankle bone. Wrap it around just below the knee or right on the knee. In fact, let's go right on the knee, just for a little bit more stability. And then right up in the hip crease. Take my stance. Now I've got some extra leverage. I have to pin the belt with my big toe, sink my weight. I'm just gonna yank on this belt. And what does that do? It pulls me into position. I can sink and all that, but by doing this, it sinks my position in. You could get 2 belts and do this if you're having trouble with it. But you'll notice my entire foot is on the ground and I am stable. That's what we're doing. We're creating this kind of spiral architecture to develop stability within the tissues, within the joints, so that when we're walking around, I love Kelly Starrett's basic concept of once you find your braced position, find where your maximum tension is and then drop it off to about 10%. And that should be kind of your everyday go-to. He likes to quote Musashi from Book of Five Rings when Musashi says, make your fighting stance your everyday stance, or make your everyday stance your fighting stance, something to that effect. So, right, you work on this stabilizing structure, and that way when you're just standing around and you're walking, everything's just ready to go, and you're already screwing yourself into the ground for stability, and you're ready to kick off, have active ankles for moving, and you're good. So work on making sure you have good spiral architecture all the way from the big toe through the hips. In fact, it makes me really happy that we open the stance, toes out first, because what happens, I have to plant on my big toe, and as I put it down and sink, I'm just screwing in. Boom. Squeezing the hips, sinking, and everything is now stabilized, right? So by being here, 1, 2, putting this down, driving it in, boom. And as my heel drops, screw into the ground. Really good screwing type motion, boom, to drive that stability from the toe all the way through the hip, and then you can finish off for your form or for your drills or whatever. There's a reason we start with this stance, and it's a really, really powerful thing, but let's not turn it into some magical fairy dust that it isn't, okay? It is really, really, really good at what it does, and it doesn't need to do anything more than that, all right? Good job.